Chapter 26. Reparieren. Renoir was loaded up. He had found a pair of kerosene lanterns and made off with a bottle of schnapps from the kit of a German doctor who was no longer around to either enjoy it or demand the necessary recompense for the theft. In the greenhouse of the Chateau de Bois, he found fresh lettuce, a few ripe tomatoes, and bundles of carrots and turnips, which he liberated and filled a tin bucket with. Shoved into his belt was Grigori's sabre, which he had recovered from the operating room where Durant had been taken by Halfwit and Little Man. After seeing the results of last night's incursion in the chateau itself, he wondered at the luck that allowed all three of his companions to return unscathed. He knew that they would not be that fortunate a second time. It took 3 trips down the well to get all the plunder into the cellar. Then he went back and did the best he could to cover the trail through the grass that his footfalls had made, hoping against hope that it would be enough to keep the demons from sniffing them out in their warren. Isaiah Taylor's dreaming began the second he closed his eyes. He opened them, and he was still in the cellar. But it had rows of cots that were occupied by men and women the same color as he, sleeping off the horrors of their workday. He blinked his eyes, and the room bucked up and down, riding out the fury of a swell in the middle of the Atlantic. As he tried to sit up, he realized there was an iron loop around his neck, and his hands and feet were manacled. A rusted chain held them all taut together and bound him to the deck of the ship. He blinked again, and the chains held him shackled in wooden stocks. He braced himself, shut his eyes, waiting for the whip to crack. When it did not, he opened them, and there she was, sitting on the plush divan. Her skin was the color of coffee, with thick cream swirled into the mix. Her eyes were green like some beautiful cat's eyes, and her rich, genuine laughter at his joke was confirmation that life was good, and Isaiah Taylor was a man worthy of life, love, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if he could not have those things, at least he had her. He blinked again, and it all went black and deep as dried blood, and stayed that way for the eternity of his slumber. After Durant was asleep, Caitlin laid back. She prayed that the moment she closed her eyes, she would awaken in the barn with Finbar, and that everything that had taken place since their cold-hearted fuck would have been just a post-coital slumber's nightmare. It was not to be. Caitlin was running through the bright green grass, past the weathered stone Celtic crosses that ring St. Bridget's Cathedral in Kildare. The sky was an unearthly blue, and the low white clouds hovering above it were split by rays of sun that shot through and struck the cathedral stones and stained glass. No matter how fast Caitlin ran, a woman in red, carrying an axe in one hand and a Carolingian sword in the other, pursued her at a dogged and steady pace, closing the gap until Caitlin heard her footfalls, her breath, the sound of the axe falling. As it struck her in the back, Caitlin's eyes flew open and she caught her breath. Her heart was pounding as if she had been in a full-on sprint. She still smelled the grass and the dew on wet, mossy gravestones. Renoir had returned. The lanterns he had stolen lit the room far better than the candles had, and within the ring of light there was some measure of comfort to be found. But the warmth of the burning kerosene did not quite chase the shadows out of the corners of the cellar. Renoir was the lone soul awake. He was using his trench knife to cut the carrots and turnips up. Caitlin went and sat beside him. "Can I help?" she asked. He smiled at her. It is hard not to be a nurse, not to be a helper, yes? Caitlin had never really thought about it that way. I suppose. It gives me something to do besides think or dream. Renoir understood. He had not shaken the horror of his own dreams. He was not eager to try for sleep again. He handed her the bundle of carrots, then took a folded jackknife out of his pocket and gave it to her. She reached for it, but her hands were shaking, and she dropped it. "Sorry," she said as she picked it up. She unfolded the blade and began cutting the tops off the carrots. As she did it, tears fell. Renoir said nothing. He kept carving his share of the vegetables and dropping them into the bucket. He reached out and patted her shoulder. "Ce ne fait rien." Caitlin wiped her tears. "Ça ne fait rien? What does that mean?" "Ce ne fait rien. It is something we say at the front. This all means nothing. Ce ne fait rien." Caitlin hoped he was right. She knew he was wrong. James's dreams saw him sandwiched between his father and Harlan as they bounced along in the Ford toward the Cox Arms Proving Ground. He was positively giddy. He'd never met any British folks before, just been read to about them in books by Miss Jean. King Arthur and Robin Hood were his favourites. It was unlikely, but he imagined them showing up today in bright, shining armour, ladies' favours tucked into breastplates or tied to their lances, with broadswords on their hips, riding mighty war horses, and on their shields the rampant lions and griffins fronting the multicoloured fields of their coats of arms. James did not know a lot about how the first Richard Cox had made his money. It was not spoken of, impolite, but he knew that, centuries past, Sir Richard Cox had been knighted by Queen Elizabeth and received the Cox coat of arms from her that had been passed through the generations. If James had his druthers, he definitely would have shown up to today's meeting in arms and armour, bravely bearing the family shield, a long-lost fellow knight, reunited with his people after years and years of absence. Unfortunately, none of the British men visiting at the Cox Arms Proving Ground wore their armour. If they owned any, it was likely standing in a dusty front hall in some highfalutin manor, a hell of a long way from hot and humid Cox County, Mississippi. James trailed behind the retinue of sweating, paunchy, balding British lions as Richard and Harlan led them into the shaded awning of the observation tent. He wondered if the one with the cane and top hat had received his limp, battling boas in South Africa. He would have been greatly disappointed to find out that it was simply a vicious case of the gout. Waiting in the tents, resting on each seat, were Cox Arms small box respirators, the finest in your gas mask apparel. Richard Cox stood before the British emissaries and grinned. "Now, gentlemen, I'm a fellow who likes to read. In specific, I read the newspapers daily. And I've read your field manuals, and I've seen how this here German poison gas is creating quite the nuisance for y'all. You realize that you're asking your boys to defend themselves in a gas attack by pulling out their peckers and urinating on a field dressing, and then winding that PP soaked cloth round their faces? The science might work, but it sure don't seem civilized, does it? So we have decided we ought to do something about that." Daddy gave a sharp whistle, and a yearling sheep was led out into the field about 10 yards in front of the delegation and tied to a stake by one of Daddy's employees, a black fellow by the name of Nathan Harnett. You could tell Nathan was a little nervous, but he did it all with that same, he did it all the same. Then hightailed it out of there, lickety split. Now there's a German fellow over there in Europe of Hebrew descent named Haber. He's a clever fellow, done some mighty fine research on the subject, and credit where credit is due, we've taken our cue from him, Daddy said. Behind the sheep, which looked rather distraught at her uncertain predicament, was a table with a large white sheet covering what was lying upon it. Daddy turned to James and Harlan. Gentlemen, these are my only sons. He smiled at his children. All right, let's show 'em what we've wrought here, boys. Harlan patted James on the back and unbuttoned his suit coat. He pulled the jacket off and laid it on his chair. Then he and his baby brother walked onto the proving grounds. They had rehearsed dry runs about a dozen times over the past few days, so the show went as smoothly and naturally as if they were two aspiring performers in a play. Harlan strapped on his small box respirator. James did the same. They checked the seals on each other's face masks. Then each grabbed one side of the sheet and, in rhythm, pulled it free with the flair and grandiosity of magicians, revealing the coarse tooth saws with which they intended to bisect a boxed-up, beautiful woman. Daddy picked up his own Cox Arms small box respirator. Gentlemen, I recommend some headgear for this occasion. If you prefer to piss on your handkerchiefs, by all means. He put his gas mask on and pulled the straps taut. He looked like a deep-sea diver of sorts in the apparatus. His British guests were shocked, but as James and Harlan twisted the taps on the gas cylinders, they rushed to pull on their own respirators. As the gas poured out into the open air, Daddy went casually down the line and checked that each mask was secure. A deadly show was one thing, but actually killing one of his guests would have been one step beyond. The gas did just as Daddy hoped it would. It cascaded over his sons. It hit the sheep, then rolled in slow motion wave into the seating area. The British lions stiffened their upper lips and sternly held their ground and their breath inside the respirators for as long as they could. Daddy turned to them, and they heard his smile, even through the respirator. Works a treat, don't it? The British allowed themselves a small breath of the filtered air. When they did not keel over, they were quietly impressed. On the proving ground, the sacrificial lamb was not faring quite so well. She keeled over hard, eyes rolling, mouth frothing with foam as the gas filled her lungs and drowned her. Now, this is not just your simple chlorine gas. This here is chlorine cocktailed up a bit with a 5% dose of phosgene. This'll kill your average German son of a bitch in 2 little shakes of a lamb's tail, no bones about it. Daddy smiled and gestured to his boys, who waved at the British delegation just as they had rehearsed. And the Cox Arms small box respirators will keep your sons as safe and sound as they're keeping my own right now. Under his mask, James was having a hard time holding on to his own smile. He watched the sheep twitch a couple of times, and then it lay still, dead as a proverbial doornail. But James was a good son, and a proud Cox man. He followed Harlan's lead, keeping up his wave and smile, even though it could not be seen through the mask. After the show concluded, Daddy got to brass tacks with the delegation. He walked away with a healthy contract for phosgene chlorine gas cylinders, 12-inch shells, and Cox Arms small box respirators that ought to have kept the Cox clan in the high, tall cotton for generations to come. James woke up shivering. It was not really cold, but for the briefest moment he felt encased in ice. He did not remember what he had just dreamt. He felt that might be for the best. In the flicker of the kerosene, he looked at the dials on his wristwatch and cocked his head. He unclasped the strap and shook it next to his ear, listening for any obvious tinkling that suggested a reason why it had stopped ticking. Dang it! He grimaced and rattled it again. Unger was watching. James saw him. He shrugged. Dang thing stopped working. James held up the watch to show him. Unger sat up. He held out his hand. James was hesitant. Unger repeated the gesture. Well, okay. Careful with it. It was real pricey. Guess now it's a pricey bracelet instead of a timepiece. James extended the watch. Unger accepted it carefully. James watched Unger inspect it with a professional eye. The hand's got radium on them. Makes it light up in the dark. My daddy said it'd be great for the trenches. Keep me from getting shot by Fritz. I guess he meant you. But I never even made it that far. Unger turned the watch in his hand. On the back was an inscription. For our lovely boy, love Mama and Daddy. Above that was an etching of the cock's coat of arms, a rampant stag, symbol of peace and harmonious life. The beast, unwilling to fight unless driven to it, flew effortlessly above the helm and shield. Ich kann es reparieren. James tried to digest it, but could not. Sorry, nothing changed overnight. Still can't speak the German, Jonah. Unger slowed it down and mimed a tiny screwdriver. Ich kann es reparieren. Reparieren. Repair it. You can repair it? Yeah, reparieren. James clapped his hands, delighted. Yeah, reparieren. I know my second German word. That ain't so hard. Then James sobered. You sure you aren't gonna break it worse? Jonas shrugged, not understanding. You're not getting what I'm saying, are you? Jonas shook his head. Well, okay. Guess it really isn't possible for it to be broken any worse than it already is. Give it a go. James mimed something along the lines of go ahead with his hands. Jonah took a palm-sized leather case out of his field jacket and unclasped it, revealing a tiny set of screwdrivers, sleeve wrenches, and roller removers. James was impressed. Would you look at that? I've never seen such tiny tools. Unger nodded. Yeah, tiny. Werkzeuge. Tools. Werkzeuge? Unger smiled. Yeah. Well, I think tools is better. Unger removed the back of the watch and handed the engraved cover to James. James blew on it and rubbed away the condensation, bringing the shine back. Unger stared into the guts of the watch, leaning into the light of one of the kerosene lamps to assess what was wrong with the intricate sets of gears and pinions, springs and levers. James looked over his shoulder. My, whoever knew there was so much going on in there? It took Unger half a moment to spot it. One of the rollers was out of alignment. He adjusted it, expertly fiddling with the fitment until the surrounding gears all meshed. Once that was done, he tightened the spring. Then together the boys watched it all fall back into perfect motion. James beamed. Ha! Like clockwork. I mean, really like clockwork, because it is clockwork. Unger held out his hand and James took it. Unger laughed. Nein, nein, das Rückseite. He pointed to the cover. Oh! James handed him the rear cover and watched while Jonah's dexterous hands set it back onto the watch housing, then secured the tiny screws. How do you know how to do that, Jonah? Mein Papa ist der Uhrmacher. Your papa Uhrmacher. Like hour maker? Like a watchmaker? Yeah, Uhrmacher. Well, that's a piece of luck for me. Thanks, Jonah. I appreciate it. Unger passed him the watch. James held it up to his ear, listening to the motion. Well, I'll be. Thanks, pal. Unger grinned. Yeah, good. Willkommen. Welcome. You said welcoming. I guess I can't really speak a little German after all. Jonah smiled and patted James on the shoulder. They spent the remainder of the day sleeping if possible, eating what they could, and tending to their injuries. At sunset, Renoir returned again, and it was agreed that they would spend the night silent, sleeping in shifts, taking care that no one cried out in their sleep. They settled in and hoped that hell would not find its way to them before the dawn.